Hello, I'm Sami Zaidan. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, search engine giant Google finds itself at the center of a sexism storm, and one that has implications for the workplace culture of the future. Also this week, red gold, how the world's economic growth is linked to the millions of tons of iron ore that Australia exports to places like China. Plus, could southern Spain turn to desert by the end of the century? We look at what climate change means for the region's economy. Now, this week, a male software engineer at Google wrote a 10-page manifesto criticizing his employer for pushing diversity programs. James Damore said women can't get ahead in the tech industry because of biological differences with men. The memo went public and created a social media storm. Damore was fired, but the story rages on. A huge online debate continues about gender stereotyping and free speech in the workplace. Well, it's highlighting the low number of women and minorities in technology companies, and it's exposing attitudes encountered by women while working in tech. The latest scandal comes just months after ride-sharing giant Uber faced accusations of a toxic, sexist work culture. The entire industry now struggling to explain why women are underrepresented in key engineering ranks and are often underpaid compared to their male peers. Well, looking at the latest figures available from company reports, women only account for 31% of Google's workforce. At Microsoft, only 26% of the company's workers are female. Over at Apple, 32% of workers at the world's most profitable company are female. At social media giant Facebook, the percentage rises slightly to 35%, and at Amazon, it's 39%. Well, these tech titans are very much at the forefront of the digital economy. So this episode also raises questions about what we want the workplace of the future to look like. Well, joining us from London now is Priya Guha. Priya is the Ecosystem General Manager at RocketSpace's new UK technology campus in London. RocketSpace is a San Francisco-based global network of technology campuses that helps the world's top innovators build companies. Delighted to have you with us. What do you think this whole episode with Google tells us about how prevalent sexism is in the workspace, especially when it comes to the tech industry?
Well, thank you, Sami, for inviting me to join you. It's a pleasure to be here. I think this episode with Google shows that there are still many issues around sexism in the workplace, and I think it's been a wake-up call for those of us who are involved in technology to ensure that we are all creating working environments where this sort of behaviour is unacceptable.
Priya, is it particularly worrying when we talk about Google, Uber, when we talk about the tech industry? These are industries of the future. What does it tell us about where workplaces are heading in the future?
Well, I think what we need to look at is what are the issues that are being exposed here. And I think the issues that are being exposed are around bias and don't actually reflect the value out of those industries and the importance of diversity to those industries. If you look at technology as a sector, we need people from all types of diverse backgrounds to be going into technology to, in fact, build the society we want to see in the future. That's hugely important to the industry.
And we're not getting it, apparently, according to one study I read up by the National Centre for Education Statistics. 4 out of 10 most popular master degrees, they say, for men between 2011 and 2012 included tech fields. But for women, 0. Why?
Well, I think the problem doesn't just start at the level of higher education, Sami. The problem goes right back to what we're teaching our children at schools. If you look at children at sort of 5 or 6, about 2/3 of them are looking actively at a scientific career in the future, an engineering career in the future. By that time, that gets to 16, 17-year-olds. It's about 20% looking from women who want to go into computer science. University degrees, about 16% in computer science. So we have a real problem there to understand, what are the issues that are stopping women from looking at computer science as a viable career. And I think one of them is making sure that we have visible, inclusive workplaces for them to join in the future. Another one is for them to also see role models around them who are people that they can aspire to who are working in those fields.
Now, you work with women entrepreneurs in the tech industry, and you mentioned bias. Just give us an idea of what they face, what they go through to become successful?
Well, I think, women in the tech industry, and in fact, women in many other industries too, still suffer from a whole range of discrimination in the workplace. Some are more serious, of course, and we've seen some of those issues highlighted recently. Some are more around unconscious bias. So what are the traditional gender-based roles that people are imposing on women? Things like making the tea at meetings or being the person to take a note. Those are still things that happen to women in the workplace. There are still things that happen to women in technology. And really, we're missing a trick here, because it's not about just looking at the discrimination and trying to address the discrimination because it's just a good thing to do. Of course, it is a good thing to do. But this isn't about CSR. This is actually about the value that we're missing as society, the value of these businesses if they are more inclusive. About 34% more investment returns for a company with a gender diverse leadership. That's a huge value to an investor. So we need to think about diversity as bringing value to the companies, not just as the right thing to do.
And talking about a different kind of value, looking at the controversy surrounding the whole Google episode, do you think that freedom of speech is being used as a cover for bigotry now?
The US has, obviously a real association with freedom of speech. I think there is clearly a place for people to be able to voice their opinions. But people need to voice their opinions in a way that doesn't mean their workplace is an uninviting place for people from very diverse backgrounds to join. And I think it was absolutely right for Google to take the decisive steps it has taken in this particular case and to send a very strong message to people both within its workforce and people who might be looking to join Google in the future.
All right, you work with a wide range of companies. What's your sort of advice to them? What sort of policies do they need to be thinking about and adopting in order to make the workplace a happier place for women and everybody?
Well, I think there's some really interesting policies that companies are now looking at. Everything from having blind recruitment, so ensuring that when you're looking at CVs for recruitment positions, you're not judging people out just because of the name that there's put on the CV itself. Making sure that you have good policies in the workplace for all types of people to be able to stay, including policies like parental leave, but not just limited to parental leave.
Priya Guha, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me, Sammy.
Now, Walt Disney created a bit of a stir in Hollywood this week. The world's largest entertainment company announced it's going to launch its own video streaming platforms. It also says it'll be heavily investing in original content. Well, that means its vast library of films like Frozen will no longer be available on the streaming service Netflix from 2019. Netflix shares fell on news competition is starting to heat up. Big changes too in the transportation industry. Driverless cars and trains are already a reality, but is the world ready for planes that fly all by themselves? Well, a study by Swiss bank UBS has found pilotless planes could save the airline industry $35 billion a year in wages, training and fuel costs. Those savings could be passed on to passengers, with airfares up to 11% cheaper in the US. But a survey of 8,000 people found more than half of flyers would be unwilling to get on a plane with no one at the controls. David Gleave is an aviation safety researcher at Loughborough University. He says pilotless airliners are inevitable.
It's entirely feasible. The main problem at the moment is the taxiing of the aeroplane to and from the runway. But essentially, as soon as the aeroplane gets to the runway, the automatics can take over at that point. As soon as the pilot has pushed the go button on the throttles, that's and pulled back. But that can be automated. There's no problem at all until the aeroplane has finished its landing roll. We can land automatically in fog, and that's how we land today. It's just a question of fine-tuning the system to double the landing rate, because effectively the landing rate in fog is approximately half of what it is on a normal scheduled day. I can see transition over a long period of time to something like the Apollo Control Centre. You would have a series of control centres around the world with a group of experts. The aeroplane would identify any problems on board. If it couldn't sort it out itself, then the message would be sent via satellite to the control centre, and then they would be able to take over and make various actions from the ground. So yes, I think once we've proven the technology in, say, freighter aircraft or something like that, then we can redesign a new generation of passenger aeroplanes to be aerodynamically more efficient, and then the costs will drop quite considerably, and automation will be just part of that next step change.
Well, still to come on Counting the Cost, corporate and political interests versus your right to privacy. We explore how one US state is putting itself in the middle of this online battle. But first, iron ore is Australia's most important export, and it's key to fueling the huge growth we've seen in China over the past decade. Andrew Thomas reports from Western Australia.
Today, individuals in Australia search for gold mostly for fun. Tourism operators take out day trip prospectors who do occasionally find very little nuggets.
When people find that first bit of gold, you can see their eye colour change. It's like, they sort of, it's just engulfs you. Gold fever is a fact. It exists.
A century ago in Australia, though, gold fever led to gold rushes and some prospectors made fortunes. Now, valuable quantities of gold do remain, but it takes major mining operations to get them out. This, affectionately known as the Super Pit, is the biggest open-cut gold mine in Australia.
The Kalgoorlie Boulder Pit down there may be Australia's biggest gold mine, but gold is just one of many commodities Australians mine.
Australia exports billions of tonnes of iron ore, the crucial ingredient of steel. It is the world's biggest exporter of coal. Offshore, it has rights over huge quantities of liquefied natural gas. Thanks mostly to China, Australia has got rich.
Except for Chinese people, no other country has benefited more from China's industrialization than Australia, because most of its mining exports are towards China.
But a couple of years ago, there were fears Australia had become too reliant on what it could dig up and ship out. Resource prices had fallen, iron ores by about 2/3 in 2 years to mid-2015. Some economists predicted a recession, but it hasn't happened. Commodity prices have stopped falling and to some extent have recovered. China's housing market and so its demand for steel has wobbled but not collapsed. And though per tonne prices fell, Australia's export volumes have increased to compensate. Crucially too, Australia's central bank has slashed interest rates, stimulating the economy by reducing the cost of people's mortgages and weakening the currency to make exports cheaper. There might yet be further trouble ahead, but so far, Australia's had a mining boom without a subsequent bust.
Now, we've heard there how volatile commodity prices can impact mining communities, but iron ore prices have been heading higher recently. Well, this past week, Chinese steel producers in 4 northern provinces were ordered to curb their winter output. It's all part of an effort to cut chronic air pollution. China is the world's biggest steel producer, and any reduction in supply impacts the global market. Fear of a supply disruption is driving up Chinese steel futures and iron ore prices. And all of that is helping put a shine back on mining profits at companies like BHP Billiton and Rio Tinto. Spain has been experiencing its worst drought for decades. The lack of rain means there's less water available for agriculture, and questions are being asked about what the future holds for the country's farmers. Monica Villamizar reports from Priego de Córdoba in southern Spain.
The face of modern agriculture. These almonds were picked by hand a few years ago. Now, a tractor does the job. It's still hard work, these men say, especially now. Spain has been hit twice by extreme weather, a heat wave and the worst drought in decades. Miguel Vida is examining his olive trees. Spain is the largest olive oil producer, and the weather could impact the livelihoods of thousands of families.
It's not in bad shape. It could be better, but the trees will adapt.
Olive trees are extremely resilient, and some of these here are more than 500 years old. But with the predictions about climate change, what many people are wondering is if these trees are still going to be around in the next 500 years. The olive plant only produces the flowers it can support with the amount of rain it gets. But modern agriculture does intensive oil farming. It produces more, but requires large quantities of water. The largest family-run producers in Spain have gathered for a tasting. The amount of rain an olive gets is crucial.
Of course, can affect to the quality because the olive, the final product is going to be less intense. So maybe we're gonna feel some difference, no, in the bitterness, in the flavor, but it's not going to affect that much.
Miguel and his partner Francisco are worried. The country's production could be cut by half next year. It's Francisco's children, Alberto and Sarah, who have to cope with future challenges.
I'm an optimist. I don't think this drought will affect us. There was a massive drought in 1995, and we managed to survive that.
The industry's dilemma: should there be less oil of a high quality from ancient trees, or mass production from new water-dependent trees? They are banking on the first, and up to now it's been a good choice. Their oil is ranked among the world's top 10. But the success of this sixth-generation company and the industry as a whole hangs in the balance, and the weather is something no one can predict.
Joining us from New York now is Professor Ove Goldberg. He's the director of the Global Change Institute and program director of Healthy Oceans. Good to have you with us. Well, the recent heat wave in Europe may be over, but the studies point quite a worrying picture about future weather patterns when it comes to southern Europe and the Mediterranean, don't they?
Absolutely. There are really long-term trends now that are showing parts are drying and other parts are getting wetter. But overall, it's not good on either side of that coin.
Not good at all, especially for countries like Spain, which we're told, studies say, are losing their fresh water supply. Why? Is it all down to climate change?
Well, it's shifts in ocean temperature relative to land that shifts weather systems away from where they normally would be delivering water. And so when you look at Spain, it's had a huge drop in terms of the rainfall over the last 40 to 50 years. So basically half of Spain plus Portugal has been, really just drying. And of course that has implications for all sorts of other things like fires. And of course we saw those horrific fires in Western Spain and Portugal. So there are consequences of that loss of water that go well beyond drinking and agriculture, which are important in themselves. But what's really part of the why we call it climate change is that other parts of Europe are getting wetter. We're getting greater swings. So, even in those places, there's droughts plus also, really heavy inundation. And it's that's exceeding our systems for controlling floodwaters and so on that then translate as real impacts on infrastructure. And, many of the insurance companies are seeing a steady rise in the claims as a result of this.
And even within Europe, some studies are saying within 90 years, parts of Europe may be heading towards desert land.
Well, plants need water. Once you start to deprive them of that water, and as I said, really the Mediterranean, in terms of the countries that rim this inland sea or semi-inland sea, are showing very rapid rates of drying.
We're seeing scientists in the US coming out with a different picture, shall we say, on climate change than the one that the Trump administration has been promoting. Will they impact the White House, do you think?
Oh, look, I think many people point to the many actions that are happening at the subnational level. So steps taken by California or, New York and so on. People are feeling that the American president is a bit of a transitory phenomenon. And while we have someone at the moment who doesn't believe in science, hopefully that won't be the case in the next presidency. That said, many scientists fear that the interference that the White House can play in terms of reversing, careful rules that have been set up to protect the health of Americans and to deal with the problem of climate change, will take decades to reverse because they have to then go through the whole process again. And of course, we don't have decades. When you look at what is required to stabilize, the climate, we're talking about action over years and potentially a couple of decades to get to sort of zero emissions or as close as we can to sources of energy and food production and so on that have zero emissions.
Well, looking at things from the other way around, do you think then that the Trump administration will have much impact on much of the rest of the world's approach to climate change?
Well, I mean, if you look at what's been going on, it's almost like the Trump effect has sort of made people double down on dealing with the issue of climate change. I mean, you know, Macron, Merkel, you know, the leadership in the United Kingdom, there's a resolve there to deal with this problem. And so in many ways, I think the non-science stance of the Trump White House is really, you know, a ship passing in the night. I'm sure this will fade at some point. I mean, the very fact that, you know, one of the countries that has had such a great tradition in science should be led by someone who's not into, you know, is science free in terms of the way decisions are made is quite incredible. I mean, the Americans have had an enormous impact on solutions to the climate issue. You know, and then if you look worldwide and you say, okay, well, we've got the White House over here, but you look at what China's doing, you look at what, you know, Asia and the range of countries that are sort of now responding to this issue is very heartening, given how serious it is.
All right. Thanks so much. Good talking to you, Professor Ove Goldberg there.
Nice to talk to you, Sammy.
Well, like many of us, tens of millions of Americans use the internet to shop, socialize and entertain themselves. But there's growing concern about online privacy under President Donald Trump. Earlier this year, many national safeguards were scrapped by his administration. Now, California is home to many tech companies, as we know. It's trying to protect a very valuable commodity, your personal data. Jacob Ward reports from San Francisco.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thanks, Selma, for yielding. In spite of widespread outrage, the U.S. Congress earlier this year did away with national internet privacy rules introduced under President Obama. Why would you want to give out any of your personal information to a faceless corporation for the sole purpose of them selling it? But the state of California, the world's 6th largest economy, could start holding itself to a stricter standard. A new bill would force the companies that sell internet access here to change the way they do business.
The bill does something real straightforward. Before your cable or telephone company can use your personal information and resell it, they have to get your permission first.
The Electronic Frontier Foundation, which signed on in support of the bill, argues that without such regulation, it is a very risky world.
It's scary. I mean, it's a world where no one could go online and feel that they have any control about revealing personal and sensitive information about themselves.
So why should we care about this law? Well, when a Californian like me sits down at a coffee shop and opens his laptop, the company that sells internet connection to this coffee shop can see everything that I do on the internet. And if they can connect that information to the last time I was on their network, pretty soon they've got a really good idea of who I am, where I am, and the sites I like to go to.
Serge Egelman, who studies privacy and tracking, points out that it's not what ISPs will do with that information themselves. The threat to privacy comes from everyone else who buys it.
Political campaigns might go to some of these, data aggregators to try and figure out, a list of people who they might think, might support their candidate. There's also potential employers. So potential employers might be interested about your interests, about whether they think that you're a responsible person based on those interests and your online activities. Insurers could potentially use the information when determining whether or not you're a high risk or not.
No internet provider in California responded to our requests for comment. But a recent national opinion poll indicated that the vast majority of Americans believe internet providers need the permission of their customers before they trade their personal data. Only one state seems to have heard them.
And that's our show for this week. You can get in touch with us by using the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That'll take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and an entire episodes for you to catch up on. Well, that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Sami Zaidan from the whole team here. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera is next.